screens, artworks, and rather than simply discarding those, to engage with them by imposing interpretations that are contrary to what was originally intended. And then I read this, book by the TV critic Emily Nussbaum, and she has this conception called the bad fan. Now, the bad fan, on her view, is similar to the oppositional spectator, but kind of morally the polar opposite. The bad fan is someone who takes a main character from a work of fiction that is supposed to be an anti-hero, or what Anne Eaton calls a rough hero, or even just an out-and-out villain, and makes them into the hero of the story. Her example, she has many examples of this. Walter White in Breaking Bad, a lot of people want to see him as an unsung hero, but she says the original example is Archie Bunker from All in the Family, who she thinks, and she looks at this evidence that shows the reaction at the time. A lot of people thought, somebody finally speaking the truth, instead of his being portrayed as a straightforward bigot. So these bad fans, right, I think share something in common with the oppositional spectator. They both insist on understanding artworks in a way that takes the artwork to endorse attitudes that are either morally better or morally worse than the ones that we might say the correct interpretation, right, of that artwork endorses. And I know, I'm just going to put aside all the questions about correct interpretations. I'm just going to imagine that we can talk about correct interpretations. Now, there are a lot of different actions that bad fans and oppositional spectators engage in. Some of these are just private actions. As I'm sitting here privately, I respond to a work, a television show that I'm watching, or a book that I'm reading, and I see it the way I want to see it. That's not really the kind of activity that either Hooks or Nussbaum is really interested in. They're interested in someone who at least publicly advocates a particular interpretation, or who sometimes pressures artists to change the work or to create new works in that fictional world that support their interpretation. Famous example of this would be fans of the first volume of Little Women who really wanted to see Joe and Laurie get married, and a impulse that Alcott famously resisted. They can alter copies or instances of the work to favor their given interpretation. So you have, for example, a lot of re-edits of popular movies and television shows that will cut out scenes or dialogue or characters that don't conform to the preferred view. And then, of course, there's creating fan fiction or fiction-inspired works of art that conform to and support the fan's favorite interpretation. I also want to note, it's not always morally weighted. Sometimes these fan activities are not motivated by moral questions at all, but rather are just motivated by morally neutral considerations, like, I wanted the movie to be more like the book, right? And so I'm going to re-edit the movie to make it more like my understanding of how the book goes. So what are the questions I want to ask about this? So I think on the one hand, there's a pretty straightforward moral difference between bad fans and oppositional spectators, right? Bad fans, it's right there in the title, although I have to say Nussbaum said she regretted calling them bad fans, but bad fans are bad. Bad fans are favoring interpretations that endorse violence, misogyny, other kinds of terrible things. And oppositional spectators are resisting works that contain racism, sexism, other kinds of moral flaws, and they try to reimagine those works in ways that either eliminate those flaws or redeem them in important ways by reimagining the characters. But there are also other kinds of questions about these various activities, and I think it gets very complicated because depending on exactly what action you're talking about, these considerations might matter more or less. But one problem seems to be that the fan in this case is usurping the role of the author. So Darren Hick has this example of of a film saboteur who sneaks into a film set, or actually the editorial room, and he re-engineers the film, re-edits the film before it's released, and the director has no choice to go along with it. And this seems to be a violation of the rights of the artist, right? At least Hick's film saboteur does. Now, since you're only editing copies and that kind of thing, it's not as bad, but still we do have examples. George Lucas, for example, has been very litigious of those who have re-edited versions of the Star Wars films into different versions. But the artist arguably has some say over when the work is finished, so when you can stop fiddling with it, and also, this is more contentious, what the work means. And when you go against that, right, that seems to raise a particular kind of aesthetic question. Fans also seem to lack the status of, say, a co-author. Even when fans are successful in altering works or in getting artists to produce the version of the work that they prefer, it seems to work through a kind of coerciveness that is questionable. So I mentioned Alcott. Another famous example is, so Arthur Conan Doyle wanted to kill off Sherlock Holmes, and did in The Final Solution, but fans put so much pressure on him that he eventually resurrected Holmes in The Adventure of the Empty House. I don't think this counts as co-authorship, and there may be something problematic about the pressure that's being put on. Another potential problem for these kinds of fans is related to what Sherry Irvin says about forgery, that the forger is not a real artist, according to Irvin, because they're bound by these sort of built-in objectives that have to do with the forgery being successfully passed off as another's work. And there might be a similar problem here, that the fan is kind of bound to following a work that fits a particular interpretation that they've already arrived at. Let me see, sorry, I'm just looking at these slides and see what else I've missed. So in sum, very quickly, it seems like bad fans, oppositional spectators, and other fans who set out to reinterpret and remake works, part of what we want to say is going to depend on the moral status of their motives, the changes they intend to bring about. But it also seems to depend on the degree to which they seem to want to take on the role of the artist and push out the artist and the artist's role in determining when the work is finished and perhaps even what it means. It also depends potentially on the question of the degree of creativity, artistic responsibility that the fan bears in attempting to remake the work for whatever end. All right, I zoomed through. Did I get that in 10 minutes, T?
You got that in 9 minutes and 47 seconds.
All right.
Awesome. So question time.
Question time.
Yeah, we should note that for the future, you should all type your questions, but you should feel free to type your questions as we're getting towards the end of each talk. So we'll have some questions ready to go for each talk. I actually have one half type here that I'll send immediately.
While people are typing their questions, please type your questions. I have a question from T. James, a question from T. Why not treat these as new distinct works? In music, remixes, in games, speedrunning, and mods, why does movie story culture seem to have why do you have different intuitions about the movie story case?
So I rushed through that, obviously. I do think there are cases in which they are clearly producing new works. I also think that there are cases where that's very hard to say. So how much of a re-edit, for example, does one have to do? How holistic does a re-edit have to be in order for it to count as a new work? But even if one is producing new works, I'm not sure that all these questions just vanish, because often these are serial fictions. I mean, I'm talking about popular art here, right? And so mainly I gave you three kinds of examples: television shows, movies, but are often in a series, right? And novels and series of novels that are produced and generated serially, like the Sherlock Holmes novels. So, and short stories. So when you have serial fiction, to produce a new work and insert it as belonging in that canon, right, I think still raises questions about the fan's relationship to the ability to say what is in that fictional world, more broadly speaking. I don't know if that helps.
From Nathan Wildman, do you think there'll be some instances where fans do count as co-authors? Are there extreme cases where you get co-authorship from the fans?
That's really interesting. I'm not aware of any, but I suppose you could be. I mean, you can have these cases. I think Sandra Bacharach and Deborah Tollefson have talked about some cases like this, where an artist creates a work and intentionally invites the audience to participate in the continued making of the work. And so certainly in cases like that, right, where the artist, I'm not remembering the specifics, where the artist intends something. I mean, you do have cases, like I say, like Doyle, where fans seem to have succeeded in getting their way, persuading artists, often for economic reasons, right? We're not going to buy your other books. We want to buy a book with Sherlock Holmes back alive in it. And in those cases, maybe it's successful. I don't think that's co-authorship. It would take an interesting attitude on the part of the author, having finished one work, to then say, yeah, I welcome this new way of looking at it, and I'm willing to either alter the work or produce a new work in the same fictional world that supports this idea I got from the fans. There probably are examples. I think it can happen. I just don't know if it has happened.
Okay, quick follow-up. In video games, this is from Alex Fisher, often the creators of popular mods are hired and the mods integrated within the game.
Oh, I love that.
Maybe this is the kind of thing that Nathan's talking about.
Yeah, okay, great. That seems like that would count, particularly if, they're sort of hired with the aim of integrating those mods into the game. My son is obsessed with modding Minecraft these days, so he's got it, and he's very excited whenever anybody downloads one of his mods. That might be a good example. Thank you.
Okay, Weinberg gives an example of Eric Flint's 1632 world as an example of invited integrated fanfic.
Okay.
Robbie,
write that down. Thank you.
Robbie Kubala asks, why treat the problem as one of works and not just of interpretation of works? Yeah. His grandpa is a bad fan of Archie Bunker. I don't know if he's getting the work wrong. He really is a misogynist. It's just that my grandpa finds his morally offensive humor funny.
Yeah, great. I started just by looking at the interpretive stuff and just looking at primarily what Nussbaum is talking about, which is the bad fan. And most of her examples are examples of people who are either privately enjoying their own interpretation or just in a group with others who kind of share that interpretation and they're enjoying it together in more or less the same way. It was looking at hooks that really got me interested in the complexity of once a fan decides to go beyond that, because as she says, privately just watching and reinterpreting these films and television shows for her wasn't enough. And she talks about other film critics, friends of hers, people she knows who escalated. And then I thought that was interesting. And of course I found, there are petitions, I think social media has changed things a lot. And in the 70s, fans of Archie Bunker's Place probably just would have sat in their living rooms enjoying it. But today, a lot of bad fans actually do want to do more than simply have their own private interpretation.
T, how much time do we have? Okay. Margaret, question from Margaret Moore. Are there sins of the bad fan that are sins of appreciation, not interpretation? What might those look like?
Oh, that's really cool. Yeah, I mean, one might say the sin of appreciation comes first, maybe, right? That there's a problem with, what's one of the quotes from Nussbaum goes something like this. She says, the bad fan fast forwards through arguments with the nagging wife and freeze frames the bloody whackings. She's talking about Breaking Bad there specifically. And part of what she's getting at is there's something wrong with the kind of enjoyment that they want to take in the work, that they like the scenes of Walter White, being vindicated and defeating his enemies. They hate his wife, Skylar, and everything that she stands for. But of course, that can lead one to interpretive acts, right, that will support the kind of appreciation they have. So there are episodes of Breaking Bad that are produced that seem to cast Walter White in a negative light and show him as weak and seem to take the side of his wife. These are episodes that the fans are going to be very happy, bad fans are going to be very unhappy with. But I think that's helpful.
A quick question from Ann Eaton. Anne asks, I was thinking about the practice of later covering over nudity in painting, e.g. the Sistine Chapel, Sistine ceiling. Is this bad fanship or just resistance? Does the answer depend on your moral starting point?
Yeah, I think it depends on what you think of it morally, whether it's going to be more like a bad fan or an oppositional spectator. Certainly there are types of censorship and partial censorship that are very much connected to the kind of editing, right, and remaking and re-envisioning that's going on in these kinds of fan activities. I do think it depends on what you think morally of the motives and the effects of the fans in question.
This is a question from Eskil. Do you think there's a responsibility on the part of artists to resist the pressure of fans to shape a work in a certain direction? The example to be avoided would be something like Game of Thrones, integrating elements of fan theories apparently to placate fans.
Yeah, that's great. I don't know yet. It seems like there's an intuition that there is something wrong with that, right? That when artists cave to fan pressure, to alter a story or add a character, is this necessarily a bad thing? It seems like we can envision some examples where it isn't, where certain portions of fandom have pushed for more diverse casting, right? Or appropriate cast, race and ethnic appropriate casting in certain kinds of films and other media. Is this a bad thing? It seems to me not necessarily, but it does raise questions about the status of the artist and the artist's responsibility, which is sometimes taken to be absolute for determining all of the aesthetic properties of the artwork.
Jonathan Weinberg asks, what about the minimal case of just not acknowledging some members of the series as canon? So refusing refusing to view Star Wars 4 through 6 in light of the prequels, or disavowing the second and third Matrix movies. Is that the same phenomenon or something different?
I think it can be. So there was a petition to decanonize episode 8. And at least if you look at the petition, which is still online, some of the reasons that were given is people objected to what they saw as an inappropriately feminist bent to that film. People objected to the presence of Kelly Marie Tron's character. There were explicitly racist and misogynist reasons that were given. So
yeah, I'm going to break in. I'm sorry. We have exceeded the Q&A time, and I promised to be a script. Thank you so much, James.
Let's give everyone helpful.
You can do a visual applause.
Yeah. We just want to mention that one thing we'd like to encourage is if you have feedback for the speaker, you could email it to them directly.
Please.
So a few other things to say. I think we can, I just want to encourage everyone to make use of the chat. So to come up with, to give side points to ask questions, even if we're running out of time, and because the chat log is going to be saved. And one thing from having done this before, I found a lot of people's chatter in the chat log really valuable afterwards. So this is very unlike non-virtual conferences, so we can make use of that, and just anything you want recorded for the author to know, points, side points, examples, and just put it in the chat log, and that'll be there. We're going to move, but once again, I want to encourage people, because of the structure of this, towards the end of the talk, if you can start putting questions in the chat log, that'll help us get right to questions immediately. Okay, thanks again, James, so much.
Thank you.
Next, we have Antony Aumunn from Northern Michigan with Personal Ideals Transformation and the Dangerous Power of Art. Let me...
And Tony sent a handout. It's in the...
Again. I sent it again there, so it should be just popping up now.
Okay.
All right. 10 minutes, right?
10
Yes.
minutes.
All right, I'm gonna talk through this paper, and you should be able to follow along pretty easily on the handout there. A personal ideal is a conception of the kind of person I am not yet, but that I want to become. It's a vision of my higher self, that self that I aspire to be. Now, this vision might include traits that I'd like to possess, talents that I'd hope to express, or maybe even roles that I'd like to occupy. My personal ideal might be to become a philosopher or a non-smoker. It might be to become a stand-up comedian, a connoisseur of fine wine, a devout Buddhist, or devoted parent. On my view, our personal ideals are influenced by art. Encounters with art inspire us to leave behind our old ideals and adopt new ones. So in this paper, I'm going to be talking about radical cases. I'm going to be talking about art's ability to motivate what L.A. Paul calls transformations. Now, transformations have two key parts. First, they involve a shift in our desires, our preferences, and our values. In a transformation, we come to care about something we didn't care about before. Second, transformations involve a shift in our epistemic standpoint. When we undergo a transformation, we enter a way of life that looks different from the inside. My thesis is that art can motivate us to make these kind of transformational changes. That's not to say that art is the only thing that can do so, or that art always succeeds. I'm just claiming that some art sometimes motivates us to undertake transformations. This is part 2 on the handout. Now, transformations are notoriously hard to motivate, and 2 obstacles stand in the way. The first one is what I'll call a cognitive obstacle. It stems from the fact that transformations involve a shift in our epistemic standpoint. When we undergo a transformation, we enter a new way of seeing the world, one that's inaccessible to us at the outset. Veterans of the new ideal see details that we miss as mere beginners. They recognize and they enjoy values that remain opaque to us. As such, prior to adopting the ideal, we can't really know what it would be like for us to adopt it. Thus, we can't tell whether it would really be appealing to us. The second obstacle is what I'll call a conative one. It stems from the fact that transformations involve a shift in our values. Undergoing a transformation isn't just a matter of engaging in a new set of activities, it's also a matter of coming to care or like these new activities. This is why overcoming the cognitive obstacle isn't enough. Even if we could see what it would be like to embrace the new personal ideal before actually embracing it, we wouldn't find it appealing. For what the new ideal has to offer speaks to values that we don't currently possess. Part 3. So how can art help? Well, let's begin with the cognitive obstacle. Art's often praised for its ability to educate. We laud novels, plays, and songs for being profound or insightful. But art teaches in its own way. Unlike science, art's rarely in the business of imparting propositional knowledge. Art seldom offers us clear truths and then supporting evidence. Instead, art's educational power primarily consists in providing us with non-propositional knowledge. Included here is experiential knowledge. Art can convey to us what it's like to live in ways other than we do. It can give us a sense for what it would look like and feel like to embrace personal ideals that we haven't yet embraced. Art can give us a view from the other side, so to speak. Part 4. As I said a moment ago, overcoming the cognitive obstacle isn't enough. In the case of transformations, even a clear view of the new personal ideal isn't going to get us to embrace it. For the values associated with the new ideal don't resonate with our current selves. We don't yet find them compelling or assign them weight. This is what I'm calling the cognitive obstacle to motivating transformations. Following Agnes Callard, I think that only extrinsic considerations can help us here. It can't be the new personal ideal itself, but only something external to it that can move us to pursue it. In addition, this extrinsic consideration has to be something that speaks to our current selves, that appeals to the desires that we have before undergoing the transformation. Yet, by themselves, extrinsic considerations also aren't quite enough. They're not going to bring us all the way through the transformation. They're not going to bring us all the way to the point of caring about the new ideal for its own sake. Thus, extrinsic considerations have to serve what Callard calls a proleptic function. They've got to bring us to a point where we can move beyond them. They've got to be this ladder we climb up and then kick away. A little more precisely, the extrinsic factors have to get us to care about the new personal ideal long enough and intimately enough that we start to see its intrinsic value more clearly, care about it more deeply, and so no longer need the extrinsic factors. You might wonder how exactly this change occurs, and I confess it's something of a mystery. But I think part of the answer lies in Aristotle's theory of habituation. On Aristotle's view, if we use rewards and punishments to get children to develop the habit of engaging in some noble activity, they're going to eventually start caring about that noble activity for its own sake. Something similar holds for us adults in personal ideals. If extrinsic considerations can get us to pursue the new ideal for long enough, we're going to end up or wind up caring about it for its own sake. Part 5. Here's how art fits into this story about the cognitive obstacle. In my view, art inspires us by speaking to our interest in aesthetics. I mean, this can work in a bunch of different ways. A work of art might represent the new personal ideal by using beautiful words or striking images. It might attribute the ideal to a character who's pretty or handsome or mysterious or witty. Or it might embed the ideal in a story that's dramatic or humorous. However it works, the result is that we get aesthetic pleasure from viewing the new personal ideals. And this aesthetic pleasure serves Callard's proleptic function. It draws us to the new ideal and gets us to engage with it long enough that we start to care about it for its own sake. So like rewards and punishments, the beautiful representation of the ideal is this ladder we climb up and then kick away. Part 6. To repeat, it's not the intrinsic appeal of the new personal ideal that attracts us, not at first. It's rather the beauty with which the artist clothes the ideal that does the initial work. The artist adds aesthetic features that aren't essential to the new ideal. And these inessential aesthetic features draw us in. Then if we engage with the new ideal long enough, we wind up caring about it for its own sake. Now, I've likened beauty to the rewards used to motivate children to develop good habits, but there's a difference. In the case of children, there's often a clear separation between the reward and the noble act, between the extrinsic additive and the thing itself. Not so with art. The skilled artist weaves together features that are essential to the ideal and ones that just provide aesthetic interest. And the result is a kind of amalgam of essential and accidental properties that's difficult to parse. We find ourselves pulled towards the whole without being able to tell which aspects of the whole are drawing us in. In addition, beauty can be interwoven with all kinds of ideals, even horrible ones. And we see this in artwork that depicts rough heroes like Tony Soprano or Humbert Humbert. The artist who's created these characters has made them so aesthetically appealing that we admire them even though the ideals they embody are unethical. Of course, on my view, beauty is this ladder we climb up and eventually kick away. It attracts us to the new ideal just long enough that we start to care about it for its own sake. We might hope that this process wouldn't work in the case of evil ideals, but it does. What gets us to shift from extrinsic to intrinsic motivations is the force of habit. Repeat engagement with a new personal ideal alters our preferences so that we acquire a taste for it. And we can acquire a taste for all kinds of things. We can be habituated even into liking dastardly character traits. So in conclusion, on my view, what makes art powerful also makes it dangerous. Art's ability to inspire transformations, to get us to change our personal ideals in radical ways, can be used for negative purposes. So, as Plato and Aristotle had it, we got to be careful about art's place in society. Thanks.
Thank you so much. We have questions.
We have
in the
questions.
chat.
So, first question was from Noger. Is there a failure in our previous view of the world that can be aesthetically identified, which could be used to motivate change?
Yeah, so I think that if the aesthetic appeals are going to work, they have to speak to preferences that exist prior to the transformation. So the artist has to key into some kind of aesthetic values that we have initially in order to kind of pull us forward. And different people are going to have different initial aesthetic preferences. It might even be possible for an artist to use kind of like bad aesthetic preferences that we have, or like bad taste that we have, in order to pull us through. I think that's talking about what you're saying.
Okay. Following up a little bit on that, Laura asks, you offer the example of the beauty that can draw us in. How about shock and ugliness? Can they do this well? Does it make a difference if it's a positive aesthetic pleasure versus something that might be negative?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is just for the sake of time. I talked about beauty, and that's obviously a massive oversimplification. I think any kind of aesthetic values can do that, can pull us forward. In addition, in this little short version of the paper, I'm just talking about the use of aesthetics to attract us to new ideals. And I think that negative aesthetic values can also be used to repulse us or repel us from ideals, to get us to abandon ones that we've held or refrain from adopting new ones. I'm not sure if that story is going to work in exactly the same way, but at least initially it seems to me that it might. Yeah, so I do think that it would be possible to use negative aesthetic values to achieve the kind of the opposite purpose.
Vid asks, does the view of art that you lay out, mostly focus on propaganda art or propagandistic art? What about works of art that extol an ideal, that also leave moments of doubt or criticism, which allow the readers to take the ideals apart? Moments in The Sopranos where real violence is present.
Yeah, I'm definitely telling a story according to which art is circumventing our rational faculties to get us to see things in new ways. But I think that can be used for positive purposes. It need not, as in the case of propaganda, get us to adopt viewpoints that we shouldn't. I think that art could even be used to bring us to a point where we're more in touch with our own epistemic humility. Art could use aesthetic features to get us to doubt our own value system. Yeah, so I don't think that it necessarily has to take the form of propaganda, where we have like a moralist view of propaganda, that it has to be pulling us towards things we ought not believe or values we ought not hold.
I think there's a range of questions from Anne, Jonathan Weinberg, and myself about the habituation stuff.
Yeah.
So Jonathan and I, so I was worried that there seemed to be too much emphasis on the habituation stuff, that didn't capture lots of cases, or at least some cases. And Jonathan puts it this way: I'm worried that the phenomenology of these changes, not much like habit building, is more like revelation and conversion. You might be better off reaching out for Aristotle, but for moral perfectionism. And just again, on the habituation issue, Anne Eaton writes, I feel like you described the habituation as mere classical conditioning, but it seems to me that there's more to that, namely the role of representations, which get you to feel a particular way about something represented, and over time this may change one's habits of feelings towards real work counterparts. So I guess two general thoughts, whether you're overemphasizing habituation and whether you've mischaracterized habituation.
So I want to say that habituation is only one of many possible ways in which this might work. And I agree with Jonathan that like it's not going to apply to cases where we think of like a radical conversion. And I don't really have a good story to tell about how that radical conversion moment actually happens. But I do think that the general structure is going to be similar to the one that I'm proposing, where we need something extrinsic to pull us in, and that once we're pulled in for those extrinsic reasons, we have this changeover moment. But I agree that oftentimes that can be real sudden. And in sudden cases, the story can't be about habituation. I have to think harder about exactly what Anne is suggesting here. And for sure, there's lots of different theories about how exactly habituation is supposed to work, and classical conditioning isn't the only explanation. And I don't want to necessarily commit myself to any particular view. I am kind of partial to the conditioning story, but I don't want to commit myself to that necessarily. And I absolutely agree that conditioning isn't going to always work. Habituation won't always work. And there's lots of things to say about why it fails when it does.
Okay, a couple questions from Jeremy Griffith and Benza about transformational capacity of beauty. One from Jeremy is, can beauty itself be transformative without an ideal? So can you get some sort of transformation through beauty without the ideal? And Bence wants to know whether beauty and other aesthetic properties can play the same role, i.e. this transformative role in real life, not in an artwork.
Bence's question is much easier to answer. I think that my response is like, obviously, yeah. And if I wanted to develop this paper, I'd be curious whether the process is similar in cases where we meet a charismatic person and we're transformed to want to embrace the personal ideals that they exemplify. That it's somehow like these extrinsic factors, either the beauty of the person or the fact that they're funny, that draw us in. But for sure, it can happen for things that don't have to do with art. The other question was whether beauty could transform us in ways that aren't necessarily tied to personal ideals.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I don't quite understand what that would mean, at least on Laurie Paul's conception of what a transformation involves. So transformation involves like a shift in values and a shift in perspective. So I'm not sure I could understand what a transformation would mean in ways that aren't tied to a personal ideal.
Okay, I'm going to go to Martin's question. In many cases, a thing's beauty will not just lead you to value it, but will also set up a desire to understand it better and to reflect on its nature. Do you think that this will make it hard in practice to become habituated to unethical ideals inspired by beautiful art? I
guess I don't see why the latter point follows from the former point. I think that you're right, that beauty gets us to want to think about the idea in question more deeply, but I don't see why that entails that it wouldn't work in the case of evil things. I mean, often the beauty can be so powerful that it overrides our moral resistance to the idea. And so maybe it's a case of just how powerful the aesthetic draw is. And maybe in cases where it's drawing us towards something that we're initially resistant to, it has to be really powerful. The aesthetic pull has to be really powerful. But I don't see why it's not going to work if the aesthetic pull is sufficiently powerful in cases where the ideal in question is immoral or unethical. Okay, following up on some of the features other than beauty, people ask questions about the surreal. So Michelle asks about the transformational power of the surreal. And Sergio asks what other kind of features might work. Can novelty work as a beauty? Again, I want to say there are lots of different aesthetic values that can do the work of drawing us in. And when I was talking to my students about this idea, a lot of them say like beauty doesn't have the kind of drawing power for them that I'm talking about. They need something else, like novelty or something being weird or bizarre. Like that's the kind of thing that really works for them. And again, in my view, in order for the aesthetic pole really to do its work, it has to align with our pre-existing aesthetic preferences. And different people will have different preferences for different kinds of beauty. Some people may have a strong intuitive preference for the sublime. And some people might not have any kind of aesthetic inclination for ordinary beauty at all. They might be drawn towards the grotesque or the disgusting, in which case, in order to reach them, the artist is going to have to appeal to, is going to have to infuse their work with those aesthetic values, which is one of the reasons why good propaganda would have to take lots of different forms, having lots of different aesthetics values in order to reach lots of different people with different kinds of preferences.
Okay, I think we have reached the end of our time. Thank you so much. The silent Zoom clap. That was awesome.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Tony.
I'm going to move on to the next talk. So Sergio Gallegos Ordorica from John Jay is going to talk about two aesthetic philosophies, Born of Struggle, Alain, Locke, and José Carlos Mariátegui. I should have learned how to pronounce this ahead of time. There is a handout that I'll put in chat at the moment. Sergio, do we have Sergio unmuted yet? No.
Yes. Okay.
Sergio, come on in.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much. So, this is still a work in progress. So any feedback is welcome. So, so Alain Locke is basically traditionally known as a U.S. philosopher in the pragmatist tradition, as an architect, as a main architect of the Harlem Renaissance, and he's mostly known for his views on race and culture, in particular for his notion of ethnic race. And on the other side, José Carlos Mariátegui is primarily known in Latin America as a Peruvian Marxist philosopher, as the main architect of Peru's socialist indigenous movements, and he's mostly known for his analysis of anti-Indian racism. Now, there are very deep differences between these philosophers. On the one side, they seem to belong to distinct traditions. Indeed, Locke is traditionally considered as a US pragmatist, whereas Mariátegui is considered as a Marxist. They wrote in different languages, Locke in English and Mariátegui in Spanish, and they did basically belong to very different social environments and backgrounds. In particular, Locke was lucky enough to basically get a formal education first in Harvard and then in Oxford, whereas Mariátegui was essentially self-taught. However, despite basically all of these differences between them, I think that there is a lot of potential value in putting them in conversation, which is what I try to do in this paper, in regards to their aesthetical views. In particular, there are two theses that I defend in this paper, namely that Locke and Mariátegui share deep intellectual affinities with one another insofar as they hold very similar views with respect to the nature of art and its role in society, and that these affinities are basically explained by the fact that both Locke and Mariátegui make three common assumptions, and that these assumptions lead to endorse some very similar views with respect to the nature of art and its role in society. And the upshot of my work, if it's correct, is that by juxtaposing Locke and Mariátegui, one can mutually amplify their message, which is that art can and should be used as a tool of emancipation for oppressed groups in the Americas, particularly for Blacks and Amerindians. So section 2. So what are, according to me, there's three core assumptions that both Locke and Mariátegui share, which appear in their aesthetic writings. So the first assumption is that art is a social activity and not an individual endeavor. The second is that art is a social activity that should ideally somehow attuned to the natural world. And finally, the third one is that one of the central functions of art is a moral and spiritual improvement of human life. So I'll give you some textual evidence for defending the claim that both Locke and Mariátegui endorse these assumptions. So in the case of art as social activity, Locke writes in basically numerous works, particularly in The New Negro and in Negro Art, that, and here I quote him, art in fact always mirrors social ideas and values. And in The New Negro, he writes that the Negro spirituals are among the most genuine and outstanding expressions of Christian mood and feeling. So they reflect deeply Christian tenets. In a similar way, Mariátegui writes in El Artista y la Época, which is a book, a collection of essays on aesthetics, that art is always fed, whether consciously or not, since this is relevant, by the absolute ideals of an epoch. So art is always embedded in society. Art is always social. In addition, Locke and Mariátegui also endorsed the idea that art should be attuned to the natural world under pain of sclerosis. In particular, Locke writes, and again in the New Negro, that the divorce of art from nature has led to marked decadence and sterility in certain forms of European plastic art expression due to generations of inbreeding of style and beauty. And he basically sets up, in contrast to that, basically the art of Negro artists, because according to him, Negro artists have the gift of natural irony, of a rhapsodic biblical speech, of dynamic musical swing, of a return to nature, not by the way of the force-born formula of romanticism, but through the closeness of an imagination that has never broken kinship with nature. Now, in a similar way, Mariátegui echoes very much the same ideas in El Artista y la Época, where he writes basically the following. So he talks about the decadence of the capitalist civilization, which is reflected, according to him, in the atomization, the dissolution of its art. And he mentions that in this crisis, art has lost above all of its essential unity. Each of its principles, each of its elements has demanded its autonomy, and secession is its most characteristic term. So in connection to this, Mariátegui also mentions that the death of the old realism has not harmed knowledge of the reality. On the contrary, it has facilitated, it has liberated us from the dogmas and prejudices that constrained it. The depths of the human soul are more substantially permeated by an unlikely face of Luigi Pirandello than by a likely comedy of Alfred Capuzzo. For Mariátegui, it's very clear that a connection to nature, in particular to the wonder that nature basically has, is essential for art to be vibrant. Now, in addition to this, both Locke and Mariátegui hold, and this is the third assumption, that art basically has a ameliorative function in human life. In particular, Locke writes in The New Negro that art has brought with it, first of all, the wholesome, welcome virtue of finding beauty in oneself. The younger generation can no longer be tweeted as cultural nondescripts, of accused of being out of love of their own nativity. Gradually, too, under some spiritualizing reaction, the brands and wounds of social persecution are becoming the proud stigmata of spiritual immunity and moral victory. So Locke is very clear here about the ameliorative aspect of art. And Mariátegui so basically agrees insofar as he basically writes the following. And here he mentions in particular, this is from a review from Romain Rolland's masterwork, Jean-Christophe, in which that Mariátegui basically describes in the following terms. Creating this artwork, creating this hero has been for Rolland a liberation. Because of this, Jean-Christophe resonates deeply as an echo in our souls and constitutes for its readers a liberation. The process of creation of this wonderful book is repeated in the reader, infused by the same exalted ideal of justice and beauty. So here lies the fundamental worth of Jean-Christophe. So according to me, these three assumptions basically bear three consequences for both Locke and Mariátegui. So the first consequence is that both of them basically endorse the view according to which art should not be done for the sake of art. The second consequence is that when art is basically attuned to nature, democratic societies tend to basically flourish. And the last consequence is that art can be used by oppressed groups to basically pursue their emancipation. So in the case of opposition to art for the sake of art, basically Locke writes that, and here he talks about the Negro spirituals. Strain out and emphasize the melodic element of La Foster and you only get the sentimental ballad. Emphasize the harmonic idiom and you only get a cloying sentimental lead. Overemphasize the rhythmic idiom and instantly you secularize the product into a syncopated dance elements. It is the fusion and that only that is finally characteristic. Mariátegui writes similarly in El Artista y la Época, but the surrealists do not refuse anything as much as being voluntarily confined to mere artistic speculation. Autonomy of art, yes, but not closure of art. Nothing is more foreign to them than the formula of art for itself. So for the sake of time, I'm going to skip basically the next subsection. I'm just going to go to art as a tool for emancipation for oppressed groups. So both Locke and Mariátegui, insofar as they believe that art has a ameliorative function in human life, also support the claim in their works that art can be used as an emancipation for oppressed groups, Blacks in the case of Locke, Amerindians in the case of Mariátegui. In particular, Locke writes, "The great social gain in this is the releasing of our talented group from the arid fields of controversy and debate to the productive field of creative expression. The especially cultural recognition they should win should in turn prove key to that revaluation of the Negro which must precede or accompany any considerable further betterment of race relationships." In a similar way, Mariátegui writes, "The socialist movement in Peru manifests itself in the national art and literature where one can notice a revaluation of indigenous themes and forms that were previously despised by the predominance of Spanish colonial art and mentality. Indigenous literature seems to be destined to play the same role that mujik, or peasant literature, played in the Russian revolutionary period. The Indians themselves begin to display signs of a new consciousness." So basically, just very briefly to conclude, I think that there are some very clear affinities between the aesthetical views of Locke and Mariátegui, and I think that given these parallels, it is important to put Locke and Mariátegui in conversation in virtue of the fact that doing so constitutes potentially a very fruitful strategy to amplify and mutually reinforce forces. And in particular, I think that this is a good way to basically further justify and vindicate the work that US Black hip hop artists have done in recent years, insofar as they have basically written songs in which they denounce the plight of Latin American immigrants in the US, and they link specifically basically the plight of Latin American immigrants to basically the policing that Black communities basically suffer in the US. So I think that in light of this could basically foster the building of alliances between Black and Latinx immigrant communities. And my further project is to basically put in conversation the philosophies of race and culture between Locke and Mariátegui. Thank you.
Thank you. Quiet claps. Questions?
Okay, hold on. From James Harold. While it's true that Locke does not agree with the art for art's sake movement, doesn't he support artistic independence from political aims? And he gives a quote, "Can we not cultivate truly free and tolerant discussion, almost Socratically minded for the sake of truth?"
Right. Yes. So Mariátegui actually also does basically have a similar view in the sense that he basically does support artistic independence from political aims. And now, in the case of Mariátegui, art, because he's a Marxist, art can be used ultimately for political aims, in particular for liberating oppressed groups. But Mariátegui also says that art should not only be merely subordinated to this. That's a function that it can have, and that ideally it's a function that should be pursued, given basically his moral and political stance with respect to Amerindians. But he also thinks that art can in principle be autonomous. And in that he does basically very much agree with André Breton, whom he quotes.
Okay, Sergio, a bunch of clarificatory questions on the nature stuff. So Nogra asks about the meaning of nature. Alex also asks, what does nature mean? Does it mean natural human condition, truthfulness, trees and stuff? And I asked, what role does attunement to the natural world play in the big picture, the emancipatory potential these philosophers see in art? So in general, what's meant by nature and what role does this attunement to nature play?
Okay, so both Locke and Mariátegui seem to understand attunement to nature in terms of, and here basically the stance is negative or oppositional, in the sense that both of them are concerned with basically the fact that art in their time has been, according to them, mostly concerned with basically copying classical models, and they believe that in virtue of this, it has exhausted itself. So the way in which they basically understand nature is that which is basically, in a sense, not already art basically itself. I hope this clarifies things a bit. Yeah.
Okay. A range of questions from Anne and James and Michelle. do Locke and Mariátegui, sorry, think that art simply can be a tool of emancipation, or that art should do this? Michelle asks similarly, are the theories descriptive or prescriptive?
That's an excellent, that's an excellent point. Now, I think that there's basically a slightly different stance here. For Mariátegui, they're very much basically prescriptive, in the sense that he really basically just want art to ultimately function as a tool basically of emancipation. Whereas in the case of Locke, Locke's view, I mean, he also does basically have passages where he basically endorses a more prescriptive, basically, kind of view. But at other points, he does seem to be lean more towards a more descriptive, basically, a more descriptive stance.
Okay, I guess I'm just going to follow up a little bit with James's question. He wanted to know, so is the idea that this is something that art can do, that it does, that it's particularly well suited to do?
Exactly, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So
exactly, yeah.
It's the particularly well suited is the...
Yes, yes, okay. And this basically connects basically with the point of the last paper that we basically talked about, insofar as both Locke and Mariátegui seem to really maintain that art basically has, in light of its nature, a really transformative, a really important transformative capacity, not so much at the individual level, but at the social level.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Carolina asks, I wonder if commitment to the ameliorative role of art needn't require us to reject art for the sake of art. For instance, I can imagine a case where art is created for its own sake, without broader emancipatory goals or aims in the mind of the artist, but oppressed groups respond to this and take it up as an emancipatory tool. I suppose this is a broader question about whether the third consequence you identify is perhaps more fundamental to art's emancipatory role than the other two. Right.
Yeah, thank you for your question, Carolina. So, I mean, what I would say with respect to this is that both Locke and Mariátegui seem to be inclined to ultimately not completely reject art for the sake of art, but at least distance oneself as much as possible from the kind of atomization that they both see happening in the 1910s and 1920s, which is when both of them are writing, where you have an explosion of basically artistic movements that, according to them, in some senses are purposeless. And for both Locke and Mariátegui, art has to be purposeful in some way or another. So in this sense, they would basically distance themselves as much as possible with the notion of just art for the sake of art. But I don't think that they would, at least in the case of Locke, completely reject it. Although in the case of Mariátegui, he's very emphatic on basically rejecting it.
Okay, I'm trying to get a couple quick questions in here. Kian asks about the range of art here. Is the emancipatory power of art something peculiar or special to the fine arts? Or is it cover the practical and vernacular arts as well? Can a meal or a chair made beautifully be an emancipatory tool?
That's an excellent question, Kian. Thank you so much. So this is, I think, for Locke and Mariátegui, not something that is limited to basically the fine arts, but it's something that is very much, I mean, both of them basically think that the practical and vernacular arts can basically have emancipatory power. In particular, in the case of Mariátegui, he writes in another article about the emancipatory power of traditional arts basically practiced by indigenous people in Peru that basically involve creating depictions basically of their lives. So it involves basically both fine arts, but also practical and vernacular arts.
Cato asks, Attunement to nature seems compatible with copying paradigmatic works. Examples like Asian brush paintings, Suboku, or modern picturesque gardens, both of which have long traditions. Do these help emancipation?
That's a really interesting question. I hadn't thought about that. My guess is that in principle it could. It just would depend basically what kind of, or how basically, I mean, just to focus on the example of the gardens, how the gardens are basically depicted. But yeah, I think that in principle, the copying of paradigmatic works could be in principle compatible with attunement to nature. It would just be a matter of the artist basically not just being focused on copying basically the work, which is what both Locke and Mariátegui were strongly opposed to.
We've got about a minute left, so we have time probably for one more quick question exchange.
From Jonathan Gingerich. For Mariátegui, can art change our understanding of what emancipation is, or is figuring out the nature of emancipation instead a task for philosophy or Marxist theory?
That's an excellent question, Jonathan. And for Mariátegui, actually, art can basically change our understanding of emancipation because according to him, emancipation is, I mean, since he's a Marxist, emancipation is primarily material, but it is also cognitive and spiritual. So in this sense, art can basically change our understanding of emancipation by broadening the initial focus, which according to Mariátegui should be material because he's a Marxist, but it can basically broaden the scope of emancipation by enlarging it basically to other areas, in particular cognitive and spiritual emancipation.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Applause, applause. The strangeness of Zoom applause.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Let's get vid up. Oh, you're on mute.
Hello?
Excellent. Hello.
Hey.
So for our final paper, we're actually only 5 minutes behind Miracle Upon All Miracles. Vid Simoniti from Liverpool about satire and Borat. And because we're having some technical difficulties, so one of the co-hosts, Alex King, will be running the PowerPoint slide, and so
Can you all see it right now? The PowerPoint?
yeah, I can.
Yeah, I can see it.
So Vid, just like make a ding or something when you want me to advance.
I'll just say next, maybe.
Okay,
I think I'll have trouble figuring out the ding.
Sounds good.
Yeah? All right, great. Well, thanks so much for the invitation. I mean, for selecting the paper and for everyone for attending. This is in the show and tell category. So it's going to be focusing on one particular example of an artwork or, well, a mockumentary. So hopefully that's not going to lose too much on philosophical depth, but please bear with me if you think it's a bit philosophically thin. It's also because it's not that worked out. So I'm going to talk about Borat. Next slide, please. Which is, as I'm sure everybody knows, a mockumentary by Sacha Baron Cohen, in which a reporter from Kazakhstan goes to visit the United States for, quote, to gather, quote, cultural learnings of America for make benefit of the glorious nation of Kazakhstan. Next slide. So on his journey, he meets several Americans, and it's widely agreed among critics that the main purpose of the film is really to offer a satire of the people that he meets, who are usually of a kind of conservative, patriotic, nationalistic, thoroughly insular kind of bent. So while confronted with this ridiculous figure of a complete parody of a third world immigrant, what happens is that we are supposed to see implode before our very eyes the beliefs and preconceptions that these people have, and we see them revealed in their bigotry, insularity, and sometimes nationalism. But next slide. What I think is also agreed is that the film, like many others of that period, actually walks a very thin line between that kind of revelation and offensiveness. So that can be seen in this, I think, kind of quite brilliantly vulgar scene, really, where Borat goes and attends a dinner party. and excuses himself to go to the toilet, only to return with what looks like a bit of feces wrapped in toilet paper. And the hostess is horrified and then proceeds to show him how to properly use a Western toilet. And so this, on the one hand, of course, reveals her own closed-mindedness, right, to us as viewers, and she is the object of derision. But I think it's important to emphasize that none of these jokes could fly if we did not, at least temporarily, buy into the figure of Borat as a backward third world migrant. So what I'm interested in here with Borat is not so much the question of to what extent is offensiveness permissible in art or in this kind of comedy, but rather in what I think for the minute is a very curious kind of structure which exists in the middle of, at the heart of Borat as satire. Next slide. So this is a slightly more schematic thing. You don't have to read all of it. But to say what I mean, I just want to contrast Borat with what we might call kind of classical or partisan satire. So John Dryden writes that the aim of the satirist is to give the reader some one precept of moral virtue and to caution him against some one precept of vice or folly. So to sort of, translate that in a kind of dry analytical way, I would say something like that. What partisan satire or typical satire does is that it takes a position that the audience and the author presume to be morally bad and then disparages that position. So this example of this Trump blimp, I think, is a clear example of that, where everyone in the audience and the makers agree that Trump is a bad thing, and here he is being ridiculed. But what I think is interesting about something like Borat is that I think we will, I think we can safely say that the audience and at least the intended audience and the author don't necessarily think of the depiction of Borat as correct. They don't think that like third world migrants deserve being disparaged. Nevertheless, they are being disparaged, or this figure is being disparaged. In fact, all kinds of different political positions, views, groups, or agents in this form of art are all being humiliated. Now, if that's the right kind of description of Borat and also some other works that I'll mention briefly, then my question is, first of all, well, is this the right kind of description of Borat? Is that what's going on? And B, what, if anything, can we learn from this art? What, if anything, are its redeeming features? Next slide. Now, going a bit further with show and tell, I think that one could, rightly complicate or push against my interpretation, because one might point out that Borat, in fact, does have some redeeming qualities. At the end of the day, he is shown in the film to have a better moral compass than many of the people that he meets, as shown, for example, through his kindness or his relationship with the prostitute played by the comedian Lunel. But I think something else quite interesting is going on. Next slide. What happens in these kinds of satires is not so much that a figure like Borat would be shown to be a bad person, but rather that the kind of stereotypes, offensive stereotypes that are used to set him up as a character are never resolved and are never subverted. So in the case of Borat, I think we can speak of all of these kind of Orientalist stereotypes, which of course Edward Said influentially wrote about, which refer to the man from the Orient, or in this case from Central Asia, as lascivious, as lazy, as backward, as given to all kinds of unnatural sexual appetite. You'll remember kind of Borat's sort of ambiguous and habitual kind of queerness. Next slide. And which we sort of still very much kind of see present in some of the contemporary culture. So this is just a kind of a random picture from L'Italiana in Algeri, an opera production at Salzburg in 2018, where I think you can see very much the same kinds of interesting sort of tropes being employed as Sacha Baron Cohen uses in Borat. Next slide. And I myself found it quite interesting, being from Slovenia but living in the UK, where I found that something that is sometimes referred to as nestling Orientalisms, where, say, people in the UK would kind of immediately call everyone from sort of, you know, from east of the Iron Curtain as exhibiting these like Orientalist tropes, and we would also, for a short period, become Borats. Whereas back home, that kind of negative stereotypes get moved on further east, let's say to Bosnia or to Turkey. This is a TV series from Bosnia that employs some of those same stereotypes. Next slide. So what I hope to sort of bring to your attention here is two things. One is that whatever moral kind of positive characteristic might some of these downtrodden characters have in these all disparaging satires, importantly, the negative stereotypes that set them up are not resolved. So that is the kind of irreducible residue, if you like, of moral badness, to put it maybe too schematically, that represent a problem in this kind of satire, if we take this sort of satire to be ultimately directed at something maybe more politically constructive. Now, Borat, I think, is like kind of like a very obvious case, which I picked because of the shortness of this presentation, but I think you can see it in lots of other cases, I mean, especially cultural production of the 2000s, but I think some of the more interesting recent cases as well, but I'm just going to leave them there for you to look at rather than comment on. Excuse me. Now, I think also that this kind of satire doesn't offer us obvious ways in which we could resolve this problem through the models that philosophers have offered so far. So I think that, you know, philosophers has obviously thought a lot about various kinds of immoralist art, such as what you might want to call deliberately immoralist art, which puts you in the perspective of a very bad character. You know, Lolita would be a prime example. And what's presumably kind of good about that is that it puts you into that frame of mind only to then allow you to either better understand evil or perhaps to even subvert it. But I don't think anything like that is happening here, because we end up in this level playing field, a kind of position of cynicism rather than insight into evil. Last slide. So just, you know, to kind of solve all of this in 1 minute, what I would kind of modestly suggest is that in order to solve this problem, what we have to do is imagine what would be lost if this satire were a partisan satire. What would be lost if this satire were made so that only one side would be derided, whereas Borat would be shown as a model of virtue rather than a vice. And I think that it would be a very comfortable kind of viewing for the liberal audience. So it would enable us to, yes, say things that are morally correct, but at no point would we come out of this kind of pseudo-rational kind of liberal thinking, which, I don't know, people like Adrian Piper, for example, criticize. So it leaves us in a position of, in an uncomfortable position where we are then forced to actually restate and rethink and again defend our, say, liberal views rather than just comfortably repeat them as platitudes. I'm going to have to leave this like fairly kind of, you know, vague and as much more of a gesture at the end, but I hope to have shown or given you a sense in which all disparaging satire is a thing, and it's a thing that is not so easy to constructively analyze. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Little applause.
All right.
All right, we got tons of questions.
All right, thanks, Vid. This is from Robbie Kubala. How, if at all, is the intended or implied audience disparaged on your account of total satire? Can you just say a bit more about the mechanism by which a work disparages its audience?
Thanks. So, I mean, I think that like say in somewhere like in somewhere like Borat is maybe not the best example, because like I think the implied audience here is the kind of like liberal viewer who is not necessarily actually present as a character in it. But I think it's done, I don't know, maybe in something like South Park, where you do have, I think, kind of a liberal view of the liberal audience represented. So either it is like in a kind of very directly, kind of in a sort of like a very direct way where they're just actually inserted into the plot, but maybe in a more interesting way, they're simply disparaged by not being able to have comfortable recourse to their usual ways of thinking, right? I, as a liberal viewer, don't have recourse to like my usual way of saying stereotypes are bad if I'm sitting there laughing along with this. I'll have to think more about it though.
Okay. From Carolina, I wonder if we can offer an alternative reading as Borat, not as disparaging satire, but as a kind of political satire, where the deliberately ludicrous figure of Borat is himself meant to underscore American prejudice or racist conceptions of non-Western cultures. This isn't she's not disputing that disparaging satire exists, but pushing on the claim that Borat in particular is an instance of it.
Yeah, I think that is kind of the main reading that's been offered, like that I've come across. So that really Borat is a kind of subversion of the kind of American, a particular kind of American sort of viewpoint, right? But I think that's what I find uncomfortable about that are two things. I mean, one is that it seems to me that the kind of intended liberal audience of this kind of work already have all of those convictions. I mean, the people that he encounters are so ridiculous. The people that he encounters are so over the top, bad and silly and idiotic, right? That I'm not sure that I'm gaining like some sort of new insight or something, that I'm adding something valuable to the stock of my beliefs if I see them as bad, right? If anything, I'm just kind of indulging my own kind of prejudice, if you like, that people who are conservative are all like stupid rednecks. So that's what I find not really, but the other thing that I don't find so convincing about that is that I think things like Borat are curious precisely because they leave offensive stereotypes themselves unresolved. Like there's no point where as a viewer, your view of Borat as stupid is kind of directly discouraged. Yeah. But obviously there's push and take critically there on that question, so.
Okay, so Benson was pushing the standard interpretation, so I'm gonna move on from that. Tony asks, you suggested that total satire has the virtue of forcing us to rethink our existing moral commitments and reconsider our moral platitudes. In certain situations, it might make sense to force us to do these things, but there are situations where this would be morally problematic. For example, forcing me to reconsider my commitment to the badness of racism or sexism seems not helpful.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very valid point. And I think that's, I think we have this kind of habit in philosophical analysis of artworks that we're just going to analyze them and then we're going to see how the artwork is this kind of silver bullet that changes the world. Whereas I think that's not at all very often the case. Like, I don't think that Borat, but for that matter, any kind of genre of satire just is going to give you the correct moral views, right? It's a double-edged and dangerous sword. So at its best, it can make you do the kinds of things that I've described. But at its worst, yeah, like it's going to just make people think that injustice is fun and that like labeling people with bad stereotypes is an okay thing to do.
I'm actually going to go back to Vid. I'm going to go back to Vince's question for a second, just to figure something out. Is your response to the standard interpretation of Borat that it's making fun, that if that's correct, then Borat isn't that good? And isn't the response to that Borat isn't that good? It's just not very good satire. Because so anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I think that would be like an even better response, actually. That then Borat is not very good because it's not very, very enlightening to make fun of that particular subset of the American population. But I actually also think, I mean, I guess like personally, I just feel that like the only time in my life, in my very privileged existence, that my accent was slightly mocked was after watching Borat. And I think that, that's just to say that I don't think that Borat does this thing where it would really try to resolve that, but that's what makes it, I mean, that's what makes South Park interesting, right? Like they don't resolve some of these stereotypes. They leave them there and they leave them uncomfortably in place. And that's what I think we have to address.
Two questions I'm interested in because I'm not quite sure what's going on here from Martin and Saul about Sacha Baron Cohen. So Martin asks, does it matter for your interpretation of the piece that Sacha Baron Cohen is not in fact Kazakhstani? And then Saul follows up with lurking in the Borat case is the yet more limited case of in-crowd satire. So Sacha Baron Cohen is an Ashkenazi Jewish mockery of Russians because the accent is 100% mockery of Russian, not Kazakh. This turns out to be disparaging satire penned by descendants of a guest culture oppressed by the host culture. So I guess both Martin and Saul are pushing you to think about the relevance of Sacha Baron Cohen's actual background.
Yeah, I mean, I think he also did all kinds of other satires that, Bruno, or where I think it'd be harder to make that case. But I do think it's interesting, what's it like watching Borat in Russia, and is there the host culture getting a kind of well-deserved comeuppance? Yeah, I mean, I think that probably for a lot of audiences, I mean, I will just have to kind of leave it there. I mean, I think it's something very interesting happens when you kind of consider what happens to Borat in the areas that he critiques. So to speak, like, in Russia or in the former East. One thing that also I think happened is that you got this concept of like nestling Orientalisms, where I imagine, like, for a lot of Russians, people coming from the Central Asian republics are just as stigmatized. So if that was the intention, I'm worried that like people in Moscow are just kind of pointing at the Kazakhis and being like, ha ha ha, look at them, rather than getting that sort of subtle criticism of the host culture.
I'm going to ask this question of Michelle because I'm intrigued as what more she means. Could it be Borat is not actually a satire, but rather some sort of documentary, a Moorian one? I mean, following Moore, and I thought we were talking G.E. Moore. Now I'm thinking Michael Moore.
Yeah,
Michael Moore.
I think it's probably Michael Moore.
Margaret Moore. Yeah, Michael Moore.
Well, I mean, there's such a kind of fictional and mockumentary element to it. I mean, there are four characters in the film, right? Like Borat, Luenell, and Pamela Anderson, and the fourth guy who plays his companion, who are in on the joke. Yeah. So I'll just have to think about that a bit more, really. If it were actually just a documentary, it would be like quite a scary one in a sense, right? I mean, there is that element as well. It is just scary as well to see some of these people's reactions, if you like. Just on a kind of straight level, take the comedy away. Sorry.
Okay, from Kian, is there a line of descent from Menippean satire to the all-encompassing satire you identify Borat as participating in? What are the differences you see between total satire and the polyphony of Menippean satire?
I mean, can I just see the question, actually? Oh, there we go. I mean, I'm not going to answer that question directly because there's just, I haven't thought about him in that, I haven't thought about this in relation to especially like kind of classical conceptions of satire, and where, this sits in relation to Menippean satire or even someone like Juvenal or something like that. But I have thought about it like in relation to Rabelais, I guess. And I think there's something more similar to that, but it's perhaps that will go towards answering the question. I think what happens in Rabelais is that in Gargantua and Pantagruel, you do have this kind of caricaturing and buffooning, not just of the king and of the kind of like ruling classes, if you like, but of everyone, right? There's all of these kind of flatulent peasants, and everyone's like gorging on food, like all the different like social castes and all the different social classes are being lampooned. So it's quite difficult to see like what kind of work that is doing. And I think it's maybe doing the kind of work that is similar to what I take Borat to be doing. It pushes the entire audience into this complete position of cynicism, where you no longer see any worthy political ideals on the scene. Everyone is just like a dirty adversary. And then, maybe a good thing about that is that you are kind of forced to re-articulate your political ideals anew. Sorry, it's a bit of a dodge.
Okay.
All right. On that very cheerful note, we are out of time. So thank you so much.